Chapter 1. The Storm. A nor'easter is a storm, most commonly defined as a storm situated along the northeastern United States. They are known for their high winds, crashing waves, and devastating effects to houses, beaches, and the surrounding terrain. While they can occur at any time of the year, they are most common throughout the months between September and April, thus giving sailors and tourists the best window of time with which to stay away from the waters on the North American coast. Such are the winds of a nor'easter that they are well known for being more powerful than even hurricane-force winds. And it was a nor'easter that the sailing yacht Merlin and her crew had found themselves in. But by all quantifiable measures, the 13th of October had started out just fine. The crew sailing with the Merlin, docked that morning in Belfast, Maine, had gone to check her moorings before the storm hit, and from there, everything had been pure bad luck. While still on board, the nor'easter struck, wasting no time in pulling them out to sea. Too many hours had passed since then, and as far as the Merlin's crew knew, all the other boats from Belfast were still there, tucked safely away from the storm. On board the Merlin were her captain, Grant Green, navigator Lilly Kaul, first mate James Johnson, second mate Andrew Ward, and third mate Mathew Pratt. All were fighting for their lives through the storm, trying to get back to Belfast with at the very least their ship's hull still intact. The pumps were working, though the sails had been torn, but they were still trying.
Where the blue blazes of Babylon is that coastline?
Captain Grant shouted through the gale. A wash of seawater blasted the Merlin's port side, showering Grant in seawater. James was tied to the deck close by, but he couldn't see anything. The last plot they had, which was shoddy at best in the storm they were fighting, showed them just a few miles off Rockhopper Island, an island community off the Maine coast, with only a few thousand residences or so. They too were probably tucked warm and safe from the storm, but there was no concrete way to tell.
You're so worried about finding the coastline!
James shouted back.
We're lucky we can even see the ship!
Grant looked in his direction, washed by another wave of seawater, and shouted.
Lucky we're still alive at that!
James turned his head and looked towards the bow. Mathew and Andrew were there, the former watching for the coastline they couldn't see, the latter trying to keep his eyes on the ship's sails to make sure they didn't fail. James decided to move forward in the hopes he could find his friends keeping their struggling ship afloat. She was groaning and wailing hard in the swells, but she was riding the waves as best she could. Ever the trooper she'd been for the past 37 years of her life. By no account was she an old ship, but she was definitely being put through the ringer today.
I'm gonna go check on Mathew and Andrew!
James yelled through the rain, catching the agreeing eye of his captain as he struggled to keep the wheels straight.
Don't let your line snap! If it does, we won't see ye till doomsday!
Pray I decide to come back before I get too far, then!
James shouted back through the storm. In jest, Grant threw at least 4 Hail Marys as he watched James turn for the deckhouse to make his way forward. Grant wasn't actually a religious follower, though his now ex-wife and daughter had always attended church. James was faithful and had always done his best to follow the rules set by the church, based on the Bible, which stood as their cornerstone, as it did for every proper church across the country. To his own slight discredit, however, he would sometimes crack a remark or two, though he always felt bad for it, and tended to apologize before or after saying whatever came to his mind. In thought, more than anything, as he struggled up and over the rocking structure, James looked as far upwards into the sky as he could without being pelted in the eyes.
So, God? Gotta ask, what exactly did we do to deserve this? Was it something we said? Didn't you promise you wouldn't flood the earth a second time?
He took no longer than this to continue forward, latching onto the mast as the Merlin rode up the crest of a massive wave and leveled out again. He felt his feet briefly leave the deck as the ship leveled, but no sooner than that was he back on solid footing again. He struggled forward. He could see Mathew and Andrew tied to the railings of the bow, but made no attempt to speak until he knew he'd come within earshot.
You guys okay?
James shouted at Mathew just a foot or so away. Another massive wave pulled at the Merlin. bring her up another crest, back down again, washing with seawater, soaking them to the bone. Mathew longed to be inside the Merlin's cabin, but he had work to do.
Peachy!
Mathew shouted back, feigning honesty as best he could.
I've never felt better in my life. I love taking a bath in seawater.
Andrew shouted back at him.
They say it's great for the pores, and it's therapeutic.
Mathew rolled his eyes in return.
Anything I can do to help?
James shouted in reply, to which Mathew replied.
You can pray for the storm to go away, yeah? Lots of good that'll do us, though.
Worth a try at least.
Andrew shouted in return. James glanced in his direction for a moment. Andrew was tied to the railing of the Merlin by at least 2 different ropes, trying not to lose his footing, lest he hang dangerously from the boat under threat of being pulled into the water. James knew he was trying to spot the coastline, but with how bad the weather was, and how far they'd been washed out to the coast, there was little chance of them seeing land anytime soon. They had to try. It was their only chance for survival. They all had families back home, hoping and waiting for them to return safely from the water, but with no way to communicate from the safety of their inland havens. Any low-lying roads, beaches, and town fronts were already being battered by the wind and waves, and whatever homes hadn't already been washed away were under threat.
How's the prayer going?
Mathew hollered. James had forgotten to try, and with the turn they were stuck in, it was hard to concentrate.
What?
He shouted back, teasing the issue of the weather and the noise. Mathew caught on right away, but James didn't hear him laugh. He was about to respond when
James, come back!
James glanced at Captain Grant for only a moment before silently obeying orders. He stared briefly into the darkening fray around him, watching the water churn and froth as if begging for a meal, whether it be metal or bone. It was as if the ocean was alive, just waiting to swallow the Merlin and her crew alive. James looked back at the ship, hearing the tearing of the sail behind him, but struggled on all the same until he made it safely to the captain's side. He was pulling at the wheel, trying to turn the Merlin toward the coastline. Just as James arrived, Lilly Kaul stuck her head bravely out of the cabin door. She was trying to communicate with the Coast Guard using a radio that was only meant for music, but with an emergency channel finally active, she'd just barely managed to make it through. Grant had been waiting for good news all day. "I made it through to the Coast Guard, Captain!" Lilly shouted.
That's great news! Where the blue blistering barnacles is the holdup?
"They can't get further than the breakwater lighthouse. The storm's swelling up."
They give you any advice? Are they even trying?
Grant asked over the swelling of another wave. Thunder rolled and a flash of lightning broke the sky. James made the mistake of looking out to sea. In the brief moment the lightning lit up the sky, he could only see black. He could hear a roaring sound over the storm, and it was getting louder. He looked back at Grant and Lilly with fear in his eyes, but they were too busy talking. "They told us to get back to Camden. They said there's some harbors there."
You think we're near Camden?
Grant shouted back. He stole a glance at the sea, but couldn't see the wave coming. James looked back. Another lightning flash lit the sky, showing the oncoming wave again. Whatever part of the main coastline it was heading for was doomed, and they were right in the wave's path. James couldn't form the words in his throat. "I don't know, but we have to try," Lilly shouted back. Grant was about to say something when a gust of wind shrieked over the Merlin. It caught everyone's attention. All eyes turned to the sail as the ropes holding the mast of the deck snapped. The sail tore and ripped in the wind, and moments later, it simply vanished. Andrew, still tied to the railing on the bow, scrambled aft as the mast cracked, snapped, and fell. It hit the deck where he'd been, then vanished into the swell. Grant cursed under his breath and looked at James, just as another crack of lightning hit the sky. He finally saw it. There was another loud crack. The Merlin veered, settling with her stern toward the wave, finally finding her direction again. Grant shouted over the storm as the Merlin slid backwards. The water began to churn, throwing itself into the poop deck, swamping James and Captain Grant. Lilly was just getting the door shut when Grant shouted,
Inside! Everyone inside! We're going up!
Andrew and Mathew drew knives from their pockets and severed their lines, scrambling like rats from a flood. James, for some reason he couldn't discern, didn't move from where he stood. He was too focused on the wave. The Merlin slid up the wave. James grabbed the rail as Grant held tight to the wheel of the ship, shouting all the while for everyone to get inside. The wave they were riding was more than 5 stories tall, built up from miles of travel across the open sea. Mathew and Andrew slipped into the cabin door.
James! Get in, come on!
But James didn't hear them. He was locked on the wave, finally praying for the safety of he and his friends as they faced the storm. His knuckles were white, but he never stepped back. He didn't look away from the wave, didn't blink as they moved further and further upwards. Grant stole a look back.
We're gonna make it! Everybody hang on! Brace for impact!
But they weren't going to make it. The Merlin stopped just as it reached the crest of the wave. It hung there for a moment, then slid forward. Grant held the wheel still, shouting James's name as loud as he could. But James wasn't listening. He just watched the wave.
Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name.
James! Get inside!
Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread.
James, get inside the cabin! Go, James!
Forgive our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil.
Brace! Brace! Brace!
The Merlin rode down the wave faster and faster, cutting through the water like a knife. She bounced once, twice, a third time, then snapped. The last thing James felt was the ship knifing into the water, turning aft over bow, then slamming into the waves upside down. A moment of sensation, sound, and sight. Then, nothing.